In 1961, America came closer to destroying itself than the Soviet Union ever did, and the government hid it for 50 years. This is not a movie, not a drill, not a close call from a distant country. This happened over North Carolina, over American farmland, over American families who had no idea. 2 hydrogen bombs fell from the sky over the United States, each one 260 times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. Each one fully armed, each one ready to detonate. One of those bombs activated all 5 of its arming mechanisms. 4 of them worked exactly as designed. Only one switch stood between a normal Tuesday in January and the largest nuclear detonation in American history. That switch was a simple, low-voltage safety trigger, the same kind of mechanism used in an ordinary household light switch. The most powerful weapon in the world, stopped by the most ordinary piece of technology. If that switch had failed, as the other 4 had, the explosion would have been 8 times more powerful than Hiroshima. The fallout would have reached Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York City within hours. The U.S. government classified this incident for decades. It was not officially declassified until 2013, 52 years after it happened. Most Americans alive today have never heard this story. This is the story of January 23, 1961, the day America almost nuked itself, the day one switch saved a nation, and the questions it raises about the weapons we still carry in the sky that nobody wants you to ask. January 1961. John F. Kennedy had just been inaugurated, only 3 days earlier. The Cold War was at a terrifying peak. Both the United States and the Soviet Union were in a furious arms race, building and deploying thousands of nuclear weapons. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD, meant that both sides maintained weapons in a constant state of readiness. Bombers armed with nuclear weapons flew 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, patrolling the skies above America and its oceans. This program was called Operation Chrome Dome. B-52 Stratofortress bombers, massive 8-engine aircraft, the largest in the American air fleet, carried nuclear weapons on rotating airborne patrols. The idea: if a Soviet first strike destroyed American ground bases, the bombers in the air could still retaliate. At any given moment during the Chrome Dome operation, dozens of B-52s were airborne over the United States, each carrying thermonuclear weapons of unimaginable destructive power. It was considered the backbone of American nuclear deterrence. The B-52 was a remarkable aircraft, 159 feet long with a wingspan of 185 feet, capable of carrying more than 70,000 pounds of ordnance. It could fly 8,800 miles without refueling and reach the Soviet Union from American airspace. It was a flying weapon of civilizational consequence. On the night of January 23, 1961, one of these B-52s, tail number 876058, call sign Ty-B, was on a routine Chrome Dome patrol mission off the coast of the eastern United States. On board, a crew of 8 men and 2 Mark 39 hydrogen bombs. The Mark 39 thermonuclear bomb was one of the most powerful weapons in the American arsenal. Each one carried a yield of approximately 3.8 megatons, the equivalent of 3.8 million tons of TNT, roughly 260 times the explosive force of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. These were not small weapons. Each Mark 39 was approximately 12 feet long and weighed nearly 7,000 pounds. Dropped from altitude, they were designed to detonate either in the air above a target, for maximum blast effect, or on impact with the ground. The crew of the B-52 that night consisted of experienced Air Force personnel, flying what should have been a standard mission. They had done this hundreds of times. The Chrome Dome patrols were routine, boring even by the standards of Cold War airmen. But around midnight, a problem developed. The B-52 made contact with a tanker aircraft for aerial refueling, standard procedure on long patrols. The tanker crew noticed something alarming. Fuel was streaming from the right wing of the B-52, a massive fuel leak. The crew of the B-52 was immediately informed. They began emergency procedures, but the fuel leak was catastrophic. The aircraft was losing thousands of pounds of fuel per minute. The structural integrity of the wing was compromised. The pilot reported the emergency to Seymour Johnson Air Force Base in North Carolina. Ground controllers ordered the aircraft to descend and attempt to return to base. But within minutes, the situation became unrecoverable. The B-52 began to break apart in midair over Wayne County, North Carolina. The crew received the order to abandon the aircraft. They ejected. 8 crew members ejected from the disintegrating B-52. 3 died, 2 from the ejection itself, 1 from injuries upon landing. 5 survived. But as the aircraft broke apart at 9,000 feet, the 2 Mark 39 hydrogen bombs separated from the bomb bay and began to fall toward the farmland below. This was not supposed to be possible. The bombs were secured. The aircraft was not over enemy territory. No attack was authorized. And yet 2 thermonuclear weapons, each capable of destroying a major American city, were now in free fall over the tobacco fields of North Carolina. The first bomb deployed a parachute, as designed, and descended slowly, landing in a field near Faro, North Carolina. It struck the ground and remained largely intact. It was recovered without detonation. What investigators found when they examined it would change the understanding of nuclear safety forever. The second bomb received no parachute signal. It fell in a more conventional trajectory and broke up partially on impact in a marshy field. Its components were scattered across a wider area. The recovery of its parts would take weeks, and one critical component was never found. When the Air Force arrived at the crash site and began assessing the first bomb, they performed what is called a safety switch analysis, a systematic examination of every arming and safety mechanism on the weapon to determine how close it had come to detonating. What they found was staggering. The Mark 39 nuclear bomb has a series of sequential safety mechanisms, sometimes called safing, arming, fusing, and firing switches, that must all activate in the correct sequence before the weapon can detonate. The bomb that landed by parachute had gone through every single stage of its arming sequence. The thermal battery had activated. The low-altitude sensor had armed. The cockpit control switch had moved to arm. The timer mechanism had activated. 4 of the 5 safety mechanisms had engaged. In plain language, the bomb had behaved exactly as it would behave if it had been deliberately released over a target. The only difference between that January field in North Carolina and the destruction of an American city was one remaining safety switch, a simple low-voltage arm safe switch. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara later acknowledged what the Air Force investigation found: that switch alone prevented detonation. Robert McNamara, the architect of American nuclear policy, said publicly that by the slimmest of margins, catastrophe had been avoided. The declassified report, written by nuclear safety expert Parker Jones, used language that was stark, even by government understatement standards. Jones wrote that the bomb came close to detonating and that the accident exposed the U.S. to a major catastrophe. Stark words for a classified document. If the weapon had detonated, the fireball alone would have been approximately 1 mile in diameter. Everything within that radius would have been vaporized instantly. Not burned, not damaged, but vaporized. The blast wave would have flattened buildings for miles beyond that. The fallout from a 3.8 megaton ground burst in North Carolina would have formed a plume extending hundreds of miles northeast, directly over the U.S. eastern seaboard. The prevailing winds in January would have carried radioactive particles toward the most densely populated corridor in America. Washington, D.C., 250 miles northeast of the crash site, would have received dangerous fallout levels within hours. Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York City, the entire northeastern United States would have been contaminated. The death toll from fallout alone was estimated in hundreds of thousands. This was not a Soviet weapon, not a terrorist device, not an act of war. This was an American hydrogen bomb, built by American engineers, carried by American airmen, that nearly detonated over American soil because of a structural failure in an American aircraft. This is the part the government did not want to explain. The second bomb presented a different challenge. It had broken up on impact, scattering components across a marshy area. Recovery crews worked for weeks in difficult conditions to retrieve every piece. They found most of the bomb, but one component, containing uranium, sank into the muddy ground and was never recovered. The U.S. government purchased an easement on that land. To this day, more than 60 years later, a piece of a thermonuclear bomb remains buried somewhere in a farm field in Wayne County, North Carolina. The government acknowledged this in 2013. The component remains there now. The Eisenhower administration had just given way to the Kennedy administration, literally 3 days before the accident. The new president was briefed, and within the government, the question immediately arose: how much do we tell the American people? The official public statement acknowledged the crash of the B-52 and the deaths of crew members. It acknowledged the presence of nuclear weapons on the aircraft. What it did not say, and what remained classified for 52 years, was how close the weapons had come to detonating. There were reasons for the secrecy beyond simple embarrassment. In 1961, the Cold War demanded a posture of total confidence in American nuclear safety. Any public acknowledgement that American bombs could nearly detonate on American soil would undermine public trust in the entire deterrence strategy. There was also the adversarial intelligence dimension. If the Soviet Union learned the specific vulnerabilities in American nuclear weapon safety systems, they could potentially exploit that knowledge. Classified documents about weapon design, including safety failures, were considered state secrets of the highest order, so the story was managed. The nuclear safety investigation was classified. The details of the arming sequence completion were classified. The specific nature of the single surviving switch was classified. The fact that a uranium component remained buried in North Carolina was classified. For decades, the only publicly available information was that a B-52 had crashed and that nuclear weapons had been involved, a fact acknowledged at the time but discussed in the vaguest possible terms. The words "almost detonated" appeared nowhere in any public document for 50 years. In the 1970s and 1980s, investigative journalists began piecing together the story through Freedom of Information Act requests. Each request produced heavily redacted documents, pages with more blacked-out text than readable text. The government fought disclosure at every step. In 2013, The Guardian newspaper published a story based on a newly declassified document, the Parker Jones Safety Report, that for the first time described in plain language exactly what had happened. The headline was simple: U.S. nearly detonated atomic bomb over North Carolina in 1961. The public reaction was exactly what the government had feared for 50 years: disbelief, followed by anger. How had they not known? How had their government kept this from them for half a century? And the follow-up question, which was harder to answer: were there other incidents like this? The answer to that last question was yes. The Goldsboro incident was not unique. The U.S. military maintains a list of broken arrows, the official term for accidents involving nuclear weapons. The declassified portion of that list includes 32 incidents. The full list remains partially classified. Other broken arrow incidents include a 1966 mid-air collision over Spain that scattered 4 hydrogen bombs, one of which contaminated farmland with plutonium requiring extensive cleanup. A 1968 crash in Greenland similarly scattered nuclear material across the ice. Each incident kept quiet for as long as possible. The Goldsboro incident was different in one critical way. It was the only accident in American history where a weapon went through virtually its complete arming sequence. It was not close. It was, in the language of nuclear safety, a single-point failure from catastrophe. The men who investigated and documented these incidents, Air Force safety officers, nuclear engineers, civilian analysts at the Sandia National Laboratories, knew the truth. They wrote classified reports with language like, "one of the narrowest escapes in history." Those reports sat in vaults for decades. And outside those vaults, in North Carolina and across the eastern seaboard, 50 million Americans went about their lives, working, raising children, watching television, voting in elections, with no idea that on a January night in 1961, they had come within the thickness of one safety switch of a catastrophe. The local farmers in Wayne County, North Carolina, knew something had happened. They had seen the aircraft break up. They had watched military personnel flood their fields for weeks. They had been told the bombs were unarmed. They were not told about the arming sequence. They were not told about the buried component. They were told to go back to work. This is what classified means in practice. Not just that governments keep secrets from foreign adversaries, but that ordinary citizens, the people in whose name nuclear weapons are maintained, are judged by their own government to not need to know how close they came to being destroyed by their own arsenal. To understand why this accident matters, you need to understand what a 3.8 megaton thermonuclear explosion actually means, not in abstract numbers, in human terms. The bomb dropped on Hiroshima in 1945 had a yield of approximately 15 kilotons, 15,000 tons of TNT. It killed between 70,000 and 140,000 people. It destroyed 4.7 square miles of the city. It is still the most destructive single event in modern human history. Each Mark 39 bomb over North Carolina had a yield of 3.8 megatons, 3,800,000 tons of TNT. That is 253 times the yield of the Hiroshima bomb. The fireball alone would have been a mile in diameter, larger than the entire area destroyed at Hiroshima. The thermal pulse from a 3.8 megaton airburst would cause third-degree burns to exposed skin at a distance of 17 miles from the detonation point. Everything within 7 miles would be destroyed by the blast wave. At the center, nothing, just a crater and vaporized matter. For context, Raleigh, North Carolina, the state capital, is approximately 75 miles from Goldsboro. At that distance, the bomb's electromagnetic pulse would have disabled electronics. Fallout, carried northeast by January winds, would have arrived within 6 hours. Washington, D.C., the White House, the Capitol building, the Pentagon, all would have been within the fallout zone of a weapon that nearly detonated by accident, not by Soviet attack, not by war, but by a structural failure in one American aircraft on a routine patrol. This is the physics of what almost happened. Now consider the politics. In 1961, America and the Soviet Union had a combined stockpile of approximately 40,000 nuclear weapons. The Goldsboro incident was caused by a mechanical failure. How many of those 40,000 weapons had similar mechanical vulnerabilities? The answer, revealed through decades of subsequent declassification, was many. The early nuclear arsenals of both superpowers contained weapons with safety designs that experts now consider dangerously inadequate. The idea that these weapons were perfectly safe was a necessary political fiction, and Goldsboro proved it was fiction. Nuclear safety reform followed the Goldsboro incident, but slowly, quietly, without public acknowledgement of what had prompted it. The permissive action link, a coded electronic lock on nuclear weapons requiring authorized codes before arming, was gradually introduced across the American arsenal in the years following. Before PAL systems were widely implemented, some American nuclear weapons could, in theory, be armed and detonated without authorization codes, relying entirely on physical safety mechanisms like the ones that nearly failed over North Carolina. The Goldsboro incident was the real-world proof that this was insufficient. The Soviet nuclear arsenal, it would later emerge, had even more significant safety problems. A Soviet submarine, the K-19, nearly launched a nuclear-armed ballistic missile after a reactor accident in 1961. Multiple Soviet incidents involved accidental arming, near launches, and command and control failures throughout the Cold War. The Cold War, as it is typically told, was a story of two superpowers locked in careful, rational deterrence, each afraid to act because of the consequences. The accident record tells a different story. A story of two countries flying enormous quantities of armed nuclear weapons with safety systems that could fail, and sometimes almost did. Daniel Ellsberg, the analyst who leaked the Pentagon Papers, later wrote about the nuclear command and control system. His conclusion, based on his work inside the system, was stark. The world had survived the Cold War not primarily through careful management, but through extraordinary luck repeated over decades. The Goldsboro accident is the clearest example of that luck. One switch, one low-voltage circuit, one small component that happened to work when 4 others had failed. That component, in the language of probability, could have failed. The probability was not 0, it was just small enough, on that specific night, to not be the thing that happened. The question that nuclear safety experts have asked ever since Goldsboro is, what is the acceptable probability of an accidental nuclear detonation? The theoretical answer is 0. The practical answer, given the history of broken arrows, near misses, and classified incidents, has never actually been 0. And the follow-up question, which is harder and more uncomfortable, now that you know this history, now that you know that January night in 1961, does it change how you think about the nuclear weapons that are still out there? Because they are still out there. The crew of the B-52 that broke apart over North Carolina were ordinary American servicemen, not reckless, not negligent. They were doing their jobs, flying a mission they had flown many times before in an aircraft that failed them. Major Walter Tulloch was the aircraft commander. His crew performed their emergency procedures correctly and professionally. When the aircraft became unrecoverable, he ordered the crew to bail out. The correct decision. He survived. 3 crew members did not survive the bailout, caught in difficult conditions or improperly deploying their parachutes. 5 survived. None of them were responsible for what happened. The aircraft's structural failure was the cause. The men were the ones who had to live with what had almost happened. The Air Force investigators who arrived at the crash site and performed the safety analysis knew exactly what they had found. Parker Jones, the man who wrote the safety report that stayed classified for 52 years, knew that he was documenting one of the most significant events in American military history. Jones's report was meticulous, technical, and, in one key passage, deeply human. He wrote, "One simple dynamo technology low-voltage switch stood between the United States and a major catastrophe." The language was clinical. The reality it described was not. The men at Seymour Johnson Air Force Base who received the emergency call from the B-52 and coordinated the crash response knew. The Air Force generals who received the safety report knew. The Secretary of Defense knew. The President knew. And all of them made the decision to classify it. In the years that followed, some of those men struggled with the weight of that knowledge. Not guilt, they had not caused the accident, but the specific classified knowledge that the country they served had come within one switch of a catastrophic accident, and that the public was never told. The local people of Wayne County, North Carolina, knew something enormous had happened, but not what. They cooperated with the military's recovery operation, watched personnel in radiation suits work their fields for weeks, and accepted the government's vague assurances. Most of them never knew the full story during their lifetimes. The 2013 declassification and the Guardian's reporting gave the public its first clear view. By then, most of the men who had known the truth in 1961, the pilots, the investigators, the generals, the cabinet members, were dead. The secret had outlasted the men who kept it. What remained was the document. Parker Jones's safety report. 40 pages of technical analysis, still partially redacted in its declassified form, but clear enough in its essential finding. America almost nuked itself, and a household light switch is the only reason it didn't. And what also remains, in a marshy field in North Carolina, is that buried secondary stage of the second bomb. Uranium in the ground, 60 years later. The government monitors the site. They say it poses no significant risk. They also said the weapons were perfectly safe. The men who knew are mostly gone. The bomb component is still there. The classified list of broken arrows is still only partially declassified. And the fundamental question, about the weapons still in the air, still on alert, still maintained by people in an imperfect world using imperfect machines, has not been answered. Today, the United States maintains approximately 5,500 nuclear warheads. Of those, roughly 1,700 are deployed and operational. Some are on missiles in underground silos, some are on submarines, and some, still, are carried on aircraft. Operation Chrome Dome ended in 1968, after a B-52 crash in Greenland scattered nuclear material across the ice and created a diplomatic crisis with Denmark. Continuous airborne patrols with armed nuclear weapons were discontinued. The bombs came off the 24/7 flights, but the fundamental challenge of nuclear weapon safety, the problem that Goldsboro illustrated so starkly, did not end with Chrome Dome. Nuclear weapons are maintained by human beings, stored on machines built by human beings, governed by systems designed by human beings. Human beings make mistakes. The permissive action link system, coded locks requiring authorized electronic codes before weapons can arm, was extended across the American arsenal in the years after Goldsboro. It significantly improved safety. But the nuclear arsenals of other nations, including some relatively new nuclear powers, do not all have equivalent systems. In 2007, a B-52 flew from Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, with 6 nuclear-armed cruise missiles attached to its wings that nobody realized were there. The weapons flew across the continental United States, unaccounted for 36 hours. The 2007 incident was investigated, reported, and several Air Force officers were disciplined. It was not a near detonation like Goldsboro, but it demonstrated that the human and procedural factors that create nuclear accidents had not been fully solved by technology. The US, Russia, China, the UK, France, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea all maintain nuclear weapons. 9 countries, thousands of weapons. Each nuclear arsenal maintained by a different combination of technology, procedure, politics, and human judgment, none of them immune to failure. The lesson of Goldsboro, the lesson Parker Jones encoded in 40 classified pages, the lesson Robert McNamara acknowledged publicly decades later, is that the safety of nuclear weapons cannot be assumed. It must be verified continuously by people who know what they're talking about and can say so honestly. The arms control treaties that were meant to reduce these risks, the INF Treaty, the Open Skies Treaty, the START agreements, have been eroding. The world has fewer verified limits on nuclear weapons today than it did a decade ago. The Goldsboro accident happened in a period of arms racing. We may be entering one again. In Wayne County, North Carolina, some of the people who live near the crash site today don't know the full story. Some of their parents didn't know. Their grandparents, the ones who were alive on January 23, 1961, were never told. 3 generations of Americans living adjacent to the buried remains of an almost catastrophe. The road that passes near the crash site is ordinary. Farmland, trees. The quiet North Carolina countryside that almost became the epicenter of the largest man-made explosion in American history. There is no monument, no marker. The land kept its secret, like the government kept its secret. The names of the 5 surviving crew members have been released. The name of the pilot, Major Tulloch, is on record. The names of the 3 who died are honored by the military. But the name that matters most in this story doesn't appear on any monument. The name of the engineer who designed that one safety switch that worked. We don't know who designed it. We don't know if they ever knew it was the last thing standing between their country and catastrophe. They built something, a simple, low-voltage switch, that worked when everything else failed. And they probably never knew. That is how safety actually works, most of the time, not with heroes making dramatic choices, with engineers and designers and procedure writers and safety checkers doing their jobs carefully, and one layer of redundancy somewhere in the system being enough. Goldsboro was the test that nobody wanted to run, the test that revealed a gap in the system large enough to have destroyed a civilization and was stopped by a component small enough to hold in your hand. The 1961 Goldsboro incident was not the last time America or any nuclear power would come close to an accidental nuclear event. It was the most documented, the most clearly analyzed, and ultimately the most suppressed. The questions it raises have not been answered. They have only been classified. Here is what we know for certain. In 1961, an American hydrogen bomb went through 4 of its 5 safety switches over North Carolina. One switch kept the world intact. The bomb is partially still in the ground. The full safety record is still partially classified, and the weapons are still there. The question we leave you with, the question Parker Jones left in his classified report, the question Robert McNamara acknowledged publicly, the question that Goldsboro demands, is simply this: how lucky do you think we have to keep being, and for how long?